Today, July 19th, 2016, is the day that we finally conclude the Greek unit of this course. And it's not a particularly wonderful ending because we have to describe the occurrences of the Peloponnesian War, the defeat of Athens by the city of Sparta from 431 to 404 BC. Tomorrow, after we get done with Greece, we're going to be switching over to Rome and looking at the legacy of Greek mythology as the Romans picked it up. But for today, we're going to conclude Athenian history, also with a little bit of highlight about Euripides' play Medea, the one that you are reading for today. We will see how that part of Greek history concluded in order to take us away from the portion influenced by these authors that you've now read, the three tragedians and those earlier authors, in the way that Greek mythology was transmitted, especially in Athens in the 5th century BC, but also by other authors in other locations earlier. Okay, a few things I need for you to do first. First of all, please make certain that you do complete the point of view essay that I have asked from you regarding the act of Medea's slaughter of her children. Remember that you're acting like an attorney or like a member of a student debate team. Please make sure that you do submit that in the appropriate forum. Of course, as always, please sure that you check off your attendance in the forum. I would like you now to pause your video and please open both maps. You have the Greek world map and you also have the Athenian Empire map. Please pause your video and open those two maps. Okay, I would also like you now to again to pause your video and please find the schedule outline for today, July 19th, 2016. The outline provides for you the major events in the Peloponnesian War. Please also pause your video again and open up the schedule outline. Excellent. Okay, I think we are ready to begin. I'm going to start off actually discussing Medea for a little bit. You might find it kind of curious that I sort of stuck her name in here in the middle of this whole discussion about war, but this is actually the appropriate place to write her name because Medea, the play, was produced in 431 BC, right at the outset of the Peloponnesian War. And this is quite a remarkable play by Euripides. In fact, it is so compelling in its presentation of this heroine of Greek mythology that it is one of the most popular plays to be reproduced in much later literature. In fact, no fewer than two actresses, Judith Anderson and Diana Rigg, performed as the title character in Broadway productions and both won Tony Awards for their successes. Also, separately, both of them became dames of the British Empire. So the role of Medea is an extraordinary role for any women actress with a focus on that kind of psychological drama of a particular woman in distress. And really it's an extraordinary story. We actually do not know whether the murder of her children was actually part of the original story because we have no prior records of it. So there is a possibility that this was one of those changes Euripides made to a myth, adding in the detail that Medea had in fact killed her children as part of the retribution against Jason for the desertion for the Corinthian princess. So that would have been in addition to the trickery with the poisoned gold robe and gold crown that consumed literally the princess of Corinth. So Medea appears in 431 BC, and what do the Athenians get to hear and see? Well, look at this. Here's King Aegeus of Athens. Here is Medea, who is trying to plot this terrible murder, and she's really on the fence of whether or not she really should do it. And she also does not have a place to go. And of course, a woman in general is not supposed to be out gallivanting. Medea has already been exiled from one place, Iolcus, not to mention Jason himself. They both got thrown out because Medea had already instituted the murder of the king Peleus at the hands of his 12 daughters who thought that they were cutting him up, dismembering him, and putting him into a potion that would revive him, when in fact Medea substituted a worthless element into that potion, and in fact the 12 daughters killed the king. And so Medea and Jason were in fact both in exile at this point in Athens. So, in Corinth. So here comes Aegeus of Athens. He happens to travel by Corinth. He's on his way back home from Troy's den because he is impotent, and he was trying to find a way to learn how he could have children. And Medea says, give me asylum if I should ever get into trouble about something I do, in case I'm ever exiled. Give me asylum, and I promise I will help you out with your difficulty about childbearing. But of course, oh, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, do not Medea and Aegeus end up husband and wife? Does not Theseus come to claim the crown, and does not Medea attempt to kill him with a cup of wine? Did Aegeus make the right decision? Does Aegeus, the king of Athens, look really, really foolish on stage in front of the Athenians when they're about to start a big war? Maybe this is kind of insulting. Why don't we give this play third place? So this play, ironically, got third place, and in fact today is one of the most successful plays there is from Greek mythology. It's quite interesting to see how this panned play flourished so well in future history. There are many examples of that in literary history, and this is one of the most amusing, entertaining examples that we have. All right, Medea. Pretty violent and very disturbing play, and one can easily go back and forth about the rightness or wrongness of exactly what she did. And I hope that you will put a lot of spirit and energy into your point of view essay. Please make sure that's turned in. I'm really eager to see what you come up with. And maybe if we can get a group of you all together, maybe we'll even be able to hold a trial here in one of our meetings. It'll be awesome to do that. All right, let's now cover the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to spare you most of the details that are provided for you in the outline. There's lots and lots to say, but I'm not going to make this a 3-hour video, as I'm sure I would love to do, but I don't think you guys would appreciate it. So I will not do that. I will make this a relatively brief overview. The main thing about the Peloponnesian War is that it got started principally at the instrumentation of Pericles, the leader of Athens, because he was attempting to make Athens very powerful. And as you may remember from the last video, the Athenians had become very powerful after the rebellion at Samos, because after that rebellion, nobody anywhere challenged Athenian power, so it seemed. Unfortunately, however, there may not have been any overt challenges, but a lot of cities were not happy. Corinth, Megara, Elis, Thebes, and even sometimes Argos. That was a city that tended to go back and forth among different alliances, changing from one to the other. All of these cities weren't very happy with the Athenians' growth of power. And that's in fact what Thucydides, the historian, says was primarily responsible for why the Peloponnesian War actually occurred. So what happened was that back in 446 BC, when that 30 years peace was concluded, the arrangement between Athens and Sparta was that no allies on either side were allowed to do anything negative to the other city's allies. However, any city that was neutral would be permitted to join either side as it wished. There was an unintended consequence of that clause, because Corinth got into a dispute with one of its colonies called Corcyra. On your map, you will see that there's an island way up in the northwest side of the map that looks like a 7. That's today the island of Corfu, but that's Corcyra. This mother city and this daughter city couldn't stand each other, and they were always biting at each other. There was a dispute between them because there was another city that's actually not on your map, but it's way off the map up there, called Epidamnus. That city got into a civil war. They appealed to Corcyra. Corcyra refused to help, so then they appealed to Corinth, and Corinth did go and help. Corcyra objected, and all of a sudden a war broke out between the two of them. When this war broke out, Corcyra ended up besieged by Corinth's much superior fleet, and Corcyra turned to the Athenians for help. and the Corinthians and the Corcyraeans came together at a congress in Athens, and the Corcyraeans tried to get the Athenians to agree to an alliance, which they were permitted to under the terms of the 30 years peace. And the Corinthians came along and said, don't you get involved. Remember, because previously the Corinthians had told all the Spartans and their allies not to interfere with the Athenians when the Samian revolt happened. So the Corinthians said, remember, we helped you. Don't get involved in our little dispute. So the Athenians tried a halfway measure. They tried to give only defensive capabilities to their alliance with Corcyra. Nobody was happy with that. The war continued. The Athenians came around, sailed around with only a very small assistance, and when they showed up, the Corinthians saw them and thought there were actually more ships than there really were, and fled, and ended up giving up on a victory over the Corcyraeans. Even so, though, the Corinthians did come back, and they successfully completed the siege of Corcyra, and so Corcyra was temporarily under Corinthian control. The Athenians backed away, and the Corinthians were really, really angry at the Athenians, and the Athenians were really, really angry at the Corinthians. And remember, the Corinthians are a Spartan ally, so we've got trouble now that could potentially violate the peace. Unluckily, around that same time, there was another dispute between the Athenians themselves and their other ally that's a Corinthian colony called Potidæa, which on your map you'll see is way up in the northwest corner of the Aegean Sea. It's at a region called Chalcidice with several peninsulas. And Potidæa was a wealthy, very well fortified city, and we had the same issue come up here that Thasos had about gold mines. Potidæa revolted from the Athenians, refused to pay their tribute. The Athenians went up there and spent loads and loads of money to take down the Potidæans. One of the terms to prevent that siege was that the Potidæans had to throw out of their government any pro-Corinthian leaders. That's because of the sting the Athenians were still smarting from regarding Corcyra. So with that going on, and with the dispute going on about Corcyra, we then unfortunately have a thing about Megara that comes up. The Athenians decide that they want to put more pressure on Corinth itself, so they turn to Megara. Now Megara, remember, was a city that originally had been an Athenian ally, but it changed over to the Spartan side. So the Athenians finally decide to really go after Megara. For a while they had been embargoing the city directly. They were besieging its harbor. Now they released that siege, but now they tell all the Athenian allies everywhere, nobody trades with Megara. And that was awful for Megara, because Megara, you'll see on your map, is on that little isthmus, that little strip of land between Athens and the Peloponnesus, and Corinth is right there too. And Megara really couldn't survive without overseas trade. So this was effectively starvation for the Megarians. So the Corinthians, who previously had not gotten along with the Megarians, now consider the Megarians at least to be fellow allies, and they want to look out for them. It's curious how relations change so quickly in Greek politics. So finally, all the Greek allies went off together to appeal to the Spartans to say, this was in 432 BC, 1 year before the war starts. And the Spartans listened to the arguments from the various allies. There also were some Athenians on board who came along and said, well, wait a minute. All we're doing is running our empire. You can't tell us what to do. If you really object to it, we're going to have to submit this to third-party arbitration. But you can't just come along and tell us that we can't have our empire the way we want it. So the Spartans actually did declare war because they realized that they had allies of their own that might eventually come under Athenian attack. Archidamus was the king of Sparta at that time. That's why this first part of the war is named the Archidamian War. He actually objected to the war. However, in authority above kings, you may remember this from 300, the movie, there were 5 leaders called ephors, E-P-H-O-R-S. And one of the ephors overruled the king and said, wait, no. We cannot ignore this threat from the Athenians because we need to protect our allies. Then the vote was taken in the Gerousia, which is the Council of Elders in Sparta, and the vote went in favor of war. But the Spartans still didn't initiate the war. They still went back to Athens to see if they could still negotiate their way out of it. Archidamus insisted on that, so they agreed. Pericles stalled the Spartan effort by telling the Spartans, no, again, we need third-party arbitration. Otherwise, there's nothing we can do. So that went into the winter of 432 and into the spring of 431 BC. And then an incident happened. Thebes, the ally of Sparta up further north, very powerful, an ally that the Spartans could not do away with, had always been angry that the Plataeans had assisted the Athenians earlier. They wanted to get the Plataeans into their confederacy in Boeotia, and they decided that doing so might be a way to get the war started, because they also didn't like the Athenians either, because of prior issues about the Persian Wars and subsequent. And so, the Thebans arranged to try to take over Plataea by siege and by treachery, by infiltrating the city. But it went wrong. The plot got caught. The Plataeans captured the Thebans, who got into the city, reported that to the Athenians, wanted to get the Athenians to respond about what to do with these captives. The Athenians tried to tell the Plataeans with a message going back, don't touch them, we'll come and deal with it. But unfortunately, by the time they arrived back, somebody in the Plataean government had gotten too eager, and the Theban captives had already been executed illegally. And the Thebans saw red. With that, of course, the whole plot came open, and at that moment, war was now officially underway, because the 30 years peace terms had been violated, and the peace was now gone. So that initiates this war that now starts from 431 to 404 BC. So there were essentially three phases of the war. The Archidamian War, right at the beginning of which Medea was produced. We have the Peace of Nicias. Nicias was a prominent Athenian general. And then we have the Thessalian War that concludes it. So I'll just describe these very briefly. And again, most of the details are on your outline on Sakai. The Archidamian War was an indecisive series of battles and skirmishes here and there from 431 to 421 BC. The main Athenian leader at that time was a guy who I often during class nicknamed Ruff, like a dog, because his name is Cleon, C-L-E-O-N. He sounds like a dog. And the Spartan leader at that time was named Brasidas. Now that was a little bit later. First of all, it's still Pericles. Now Pericles had a policy in place that the Athenians were to take all of their residents from Attica all into the Athenian city itself and abandon the countryside, because the Spartans were going to come in and invade it every year. So he did this. Of course, morale went way down when he did that, because all of the countrymen had to watch the Spartans come in and destroy their land year after year after year, including a lot of valuable olive trees and vineyards and various countryside festivals and such that could no longer occur, and so on. So this was a rather dangerous policy for Pericles to pull in, because really he got a lot of people very angry at him for doing all this. But they went along with it because Pericles was so popular. There was, however, a consequence. With all of those people squashed into the city which was never particularly sanitary to begin with, became a lot more unsanitary. And an Athenian detachment that went off further east picked up a strain of plague, and it got back into the city, and it went all through the city. That's the plague I referred to in yesterday's video when I was talking about Sophocles as Oedipus King, that it might be very well have been in 427 BC because of a plague at Athens. This is the plague I'm referring to. The plague really ran roughshod in the Athenian population and greatly weakened their war effort. And the Athenians, besides that, were also spending a lot of money up in Potidæa for that siege going on. So the Periclean war policy didn't seem to be working very well. He was actually fired from his office, but came back in, and then unfortunately he died of the plague. So his successor was Cleon, the rough guy. Cleon had the reputation of standing in front of the Athenian assembly and barking like a dog anytime he wanted to get something done and scaring everybody to death. So Cleon took on a much more aggressive policy against both the Spartans and the Thebans, despite the fact that Pericles also had told the Athenians, never fight Spartans and Thebans on land. You will lose. Cleon did not listen to that, and that turned out to be very costly. But Brasidas was having, and the Spartans were having their problems too, because they didn't really know how to deal with the Athenian fleet, which was really, really powerful at sea. And they were just generally slow to react, and they just didn't really have a very effective way of doing anything other than just these yearly invasions into Attica, which eventually ended up not really doing very much and were really very expensive for the Spartans to carry out. So the war just dragged on like this. And there were a couple of rebellions. One bad thing happened in Corcyra, which was that Corcyra had a civil war that broke out. That's when their hostages that were taken to Corinth actually went back to Corcyra and started a civil war there by saying, Corinthians are really quite nice, we should put them back in power. And so Corcyra completely broke apart civilly. Never was the same after that, and never was able to contribute to the war effort as they promised they would be able to. So both sides were suffering a lot. In 425 BC, however, the Spartans had some prisoners captured in the southwest area called Pylos, because the Athenians ended up, kind of by accident, invading there and getting a foothold there. And when the Spartans sent some men over there and camped out on an island nearby, they actually got captured there. And then the Athenians suddenly got confident, and they went around and captured an island off of Sparta, the Spartan coast, called Cythera. That was our general Nicias who did that. And now the Spartans had real trouble. They had prisoners, and they had this outpost at Cythera, as well as the outpost at Pylos. This was not good. But then the Athenians got overconfident, and in the following year, they invaded Boeotia. They wanted to knock out Thebes, and that was a disastrous mistake. They'd been told not to do that, and they did it anyway. And unfortunately, they lost an entire army up at a place called Delium, 424 BC. That was one of their worst land losses anywhere in their history. So the Athenians had that setback. When the Spartans saw that disaster occur, they quickly took advantage of the opportunity, Brasidas did, to gang up on a city that the Athenians weren't paying attention to called Amphipolis, way up in the north. You can see it on your map. This was an old colony of the Athenians for gold mining. And the Spartans tricked the general Thucydides, the historian, from abandoning the city by going somewhere else, thinking that the Spartans would attack there, and then moving in, and it was a bloodless coup. The Peloponnesians just opened their gates, and the Spartans just came right in. The Athenians lost that city and lost Delium, but the Spartans had those prisoners that they really weren't happy not to have, and those two outposts. So, following year, 423 BC, there was an armistice. 422 BC, however, Cleon broke the armistice by re-attacking Amphipolis. It failed. Brasidas caught Cleon making a mistake in maneuvering his army. Cleon and Brasidas were both killed. Amphipolis stayed in Spartan hands. Following year, with the loss of those two generals, the Athenians and the Spartans agreed to make peace. The peace terms were basically that everybody would get back everything that they had before. Again, no more allies attacking allies. And now the Athenians demanded back Amphipolis. They also demanded a place called Panactum come back to them. That was a fort that they had up in Boeotia from back in the days of the First Peloponnesian War. The fort fell into Boeotian hands when the Battle of Delium happened. So the Athenians wanted those two places back. The Spartans wanted back their prisoners, and they wanted the two outposts of Pylos and Cythera to be evacuated. This peace negotiation started off on paper looking excellent, but it failed because when the Spartans wanted to get the city to go back to Athens, Amphipolis, they refused to do it. So the Athenians accused the Spartans of bad faith. So this is now in the peace period called the Peace of Nicias. So Archidamus is still the king of the king of Sparta, but that part of the war has actually concluded, and now we're in the Peace of Nicias. But it's not really a peace, because what do the Athenians do? They team up with three other cities, Argos, Elis, and Mantinea. Argos liked the Athenians right now, for its own reasons. Elis didn't like Spartans because there had been disputes about running the Olympic Games. The Eleans were responsible for that. They had let the Spartans do it once, but then the Spartans did something that the Eleans thought was impious, and so the Eleans and the Spartans had a dispute there. And the Mantineans were a city north of Sparta that had been an old colony from many years ago. They had originally been 4 villages, and the Spartans had forced them to become one large city subordinate to Sparta. And they never liked the Spartans very much, and they were always looking for an opportunity to get free of them. So these 4 cities teamed up on the Spartans to punish them for bad faith in the peace. Ironically, the Athenians and the Spartans actually had an alliance. And still that was not enough to prevent further disputes. Well, there were various land maneuvers that were carried out. And then in 418 BC came one of the biggest land battles any time in the history of Greece, right outside of Mantinea. It actually started at Argos on the Lelantine plain when the Spartans invaded there. But then the Spartans switched over to the main allied army that was right outside of Mantinea. A major battle was fought, and it looked like the alliance would do it. But once again, like with Cleon up at Amphipolis, they made a mistake with their maneuvering. This was actually two phalanx armies that were coming together like this. The phalanxes were the hoplites that had a shield like this and a spear like this, and they had to run together as a phalanx. And normally the two phalanxes would crash together like this. But what happened because of the mistake was that they missed each other. And then the Spartans quickly turned on the allied army and defeated it. And that was a really stunning loss for the Athenians, and it pretty much broke up that four-way alliance. And the Spartans were very fortunate. They continued to be in power. The Athenians got so mad that they had another minor revolution between Nicias and another general named Alcibiades. The two of them were blaming each other because they were on opposite sides for what was going on, and there was a stalemate at Athens. And then the following year, the Athenians learned that a city called Melos, on an island down in the southern Aegean, never part of the Delian League, had pretended to be neutral. But in reality, they had been sending supplies to Sparta illegally and furtively. So the Athenians went down there and ganged up on it. And then in 415 BC, the Athenians learned that one of their allies in Sicily, was having a dispute with a Spartan ally out there. The Athenians sent a huge fleet out there in order to try, and Nicias went along, in order to try to first deal with the dispute, but then eventually it got inflated into trying to take over the whole island of Sicily. And that was a terrible failure that actually lost them their whole fleet out there. And part of the problem was that their other general, Alcibiades, was teamed up with Nicias, but Alcibiades had been accused of a terrible incident involving these Hermes statues that had a phallus on it, where somebody on the day that the expedition went out to Sicily came along and cut all the phalluses off. And that was essentially a rebellious act, and Alcibiades got fingered. He was kind of a dandy-like guy, and he had a tendency to break into mystery cults and spy on them, so he was fingered as being responsible for it, which he probably wasn't. So he ended up defecting from the Sicilian expedition, and he went to go and tell the Spartans about it. And the Spartans were able to respond, and that was one of the main reasons why the Athenians lost their fleet out in Sicily. So, unfortunately, the Athenians had attacked some of Spartan ports at the insistence of Argos, their erstwhile ally in that big alliance, and so the Athenians were back at war again. Well, the Spartans this time were better prepared. In this phase of the war, Decelean War, the Spartans fortified Decelia, right outside of Athens, inside Attica. This was King Agis, because Archidamus had died by now. King Agis did this, and Agis figured out that doing that would save them the expense of having to invade Attica year after year after year. As a result, the Spartans were much better placed for taking on the Athenians. Still, despite that, for a while, however, the Athenians kept on winning victories out in the Aegean Sea. The one who finally, however, learned how to beat the Athenians at sea, was Lysander of Sparta. He got the Athenians trained, and there were several more battles where gradually Lysander was able to turn Spartan strength against the Athenians and finally wear them down. The big defeat of the Athenians that showed that the Spartans were able to pull this off occurred in 407 BC. That General Alcibiades of Athens finally got recalled. He, in fact, was not able to get along well with the Spartans. He actually caused a huge rebellion in Athens, whereby there was a coup that overthrew the democracy for about a year, called the oligarchic coup. But that eventually fizzled out because the new government wasn't able to run the government properly. And so then eventually the democracy came back when they started winning wars under the democracy again. And then Alcibiades got himself recalled. He became general now of Athens once again, But then, in 407 BC, Lysander scored a big victory against an Athenian army at a place called Notion. And Alcibiades got blamed, even though he wasn't there, and he got exiled again. 406 BC, a new Spartan general was in command. While he was in command, there was a Spartan fleet that pinned down an Athenian fleet up near Lesbos at a place called Arginusae. And when that happened, the Athenians snuck a ship past the blockade at night to tell the Athenians at home, we have an emergency, come and help. So the Athenians sent all of their slaves and as many other men as they could cram onto triremes all the way out to Lesbos with the promise that if they won, the slaves would be set free. This had never happened before, any time, anywhere in Greek history. And in fact, the Athenians won that battle, and the new Spartan general, whose name was Callicratidas, actually fell overboard his ship and drowned, and that put an end to him. However, the Athenians suffered another setback of their own because there was a storm right after that battle, and the Athenians failed to save a lot of men who were drowning in the storm waters. As a result, they were lost at sea, and the Athenian generals were called to trial back at home in Athens illegally together as a single defendant. Of all people, Socrates, the philosopher, was actually the epistates that day in the government, the one who was overseeing the assembly, in this case the trial of these generals. And Socrates tried to stop the trial, but unfortunately he only had a one-day appointment, so the next epistates after him simply went ahead and called the trial. Eventually, those generals were convicted, and the Athenians ended up discovering very shortly thereafter that they had just executed all their best generals. And that was a disastrous mistake, despite the fact that Socrates had warned them not to do that. So, 405 BC, Lysander is back in control in Sparta. The Athenians now take their fleet up into the northeast Aegean because Lysander is doing maneuvers up there. And eventually Lysander sacks a city up there, and the Athenians camp on a beach opposite that city along the Hellespont Strait. You should see that on your map in the northeast corner of the Peloponnesus. I'm sorry, of the Aegean Sea, excuse me. The strait up there that's called the Hellespont. So the Athenians were on the west side, which would be the west coast of the Hellespont, and Lysander was over on the right side, the eastern side, at the other city. And there was this maneuvering going on back and forth between the Athenian fleet and the Spartan fleet. Alcibiades was actually in the area and came and warned the Athenian fleet not to do what they were doing because they were actually trapped in this area, and they didn't listen to him because he was regarded as an exile and a traitor, so they rejected him. Lysander pulled off this trick of tempting the Athenians into battle by attacking them, but it was really a feint. And the Athenians came out, and then the two of them stared at each other and then went back away again, and the Athenians kept thinking, well, they're not really going to fight. Eventually, however, the Athenians tried this. The Spartans came out and met them. The Athenians went back, but the Spartans were watching. When the Athenians went back to the beach, they started disembarking all the men, and then the Spartans watched and watched and watched, and finally Lysander gave a signal, the fleet came around and got the whole Athenian fleet, 405 BC. Ironically, Aristophanes' play Frogs had warned the Athenians not to have incompetent generals in control, that they probably needed Alcibiades back, even though they really didn't want him. But once again, good advice went on deaf ears, and with disastrous consequences. The Athenians thereupon immediately lost the war, although they actually did not surrender until the next year, 404 BC, because the Spartans now had the full fleet. They just brought their fleet over to the Piraeus harbor and blockaded it, and the Athenians were stuck. So this is effectively the end of one of the most important periods of Greek history, when the Athenians were in really mighty control of the Aegean Sea. Obviously, Greek history itself continued for another 4 centuries, and the Athenians themselves even had an opportunity to become powerful again in the very next century. But there was never again a prime period, especially for the literary output, like Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, that was produced as this time period that now concludes. Okay, that concludes our video on the Peloponnesian War, as well as the Greek unit of the course. Please make sure that your point of view composition is in for Euripides, and if you have not already gotten them in, please make sure that your 2 character presentations are in for Aeschylus and Sophocles. So we turn now tomorrow, July 20th, 2016, to the Roman side of things. We're going to spend a little time talking about Roman history and then looking at the 2 great authors, Virgil and Ovid, as we go into our final week of the Greek mythology course. We'll see you tomorrow.